Hi, welcome to the July 12th meeting of the CNCF IoT Edge Working Group. Last I looked, we have a kind of light agenda today, but after we cover the items in there now, which I think are primarily covering upcoming open source and edge related conferences, we'll move on to just free-form birds of a feather discussion of anything anybody wants to talk about, including interesting things you've seen lately or questions you have or things you'd like to open for group sharing and discussion. So I put the conference summary up there. Item 1 is KubeCon North America, which is operated by the CNCF, which manages this group. The regular CFPs are closed, but they have two categories that are still open. One is the Kubernetes on the Edge Day. That is an extra cost day one, so-called pre-event. It's open for registration and CFP submits for until August the 6th. It's pretty open-ended on anything related to Edge, so long as it covers, as it intersects with open source. Then also at the event, this working group has an option to submit a maintainer track CFP that would occur in the main body of the conference. There's no guaranteed acceptance of that, and in the past year, those have been much tougher to get than they have been historically. So as a group, we could apply to get one of those sessions, and we might get that accepted if we apply. Moving on to other conferences, somebody added Cloud Native Telco Day. Whoever did that, do you want to jump on the mic and amplify that if you know details?
Yeah, sure, Stephen. This is Brandon. We've been a part of this day in the past. It is a co-located event for KubeCon, also on November 6th. And I put a link to the description, and similarly to Kubernetes on Edge Day. The CFP is coming up on August 6th. So might be relevant to this group, those working on cloud native apps and development for the telco space. Might be worth just looking at the agenda as well as it develops to see what's happening in that space. And it is, I think it's to some degree concurrent with Kubernetes on Edge. So just wanted to point that out to folks. We're considering that, and we've been a part of it in the past, and it's been fairly successful for us. So wanted the group just to be aware of that upcoming deadline as well.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brandon. Just FYI, I'm assuming they're going to have a WebAssembly day as well, and there has been a fair amount of overlap with WebAssembly and Edge as well. And all of those events are on the same day. It's one registration, and you're free to look at the schedule and shift back and forth between rooms. The other thing that I've noticed, particularly in Europe, is it's sold out very early. So they have a limited amount of space for those day one events that's shared across all the events. I think that it's in the range of holding 2,000 to 3,500 people. And in Europe, it sold out before they even had the schedule up. So people went and paid for those extra cost registrations before they could even see fully what they were getting into, but it still sold out. So I kind of expect that that is likely to continue. Historically, the North America conference has had higher attendance than the Europe one. So if you're interested in going as an attendee, you might want to get your registration in early, or clear the process if you're with a bureaucratic org that requires pre-approval for conference attendance. Go get that in the pipeline for your management to approve early so you don't get left out. moving on in the conference list, there's Open Source Summit Japan, which isn't until December, but the CFPs are open now. And that's general open source, but that conference has always been particularly strong on edge and embedded, particularly in the automotive sector, but it covers edge in general. There's a one-day conference, Tiny ML Machine Learning Asia in South Korea in November, that's open for submits. EclipseCon is closed, but they have published their schedule, and there's a lot of edge material in Germany in October. And KubeCon combined with Open Source Summit China CFPs are closed, but it's open for registration. I looked this morning and they don't have a schedule published yet, so you can't exactly see yet what got accepted and what you'd be in for if you were to attend. And somebody added Linux Open Source Summit Europe. Yeah, go ahead and cover it.
Yeah, it's taking place in September. The call for papers aren't open yet, but there are still some being filled up. Because I was chatting to someone in LF Edge around a talk the other day as well. So it may be interesting for people.
Okay, sounds good. Boy, if they haven't even opened it yet for a September conference, that's cutting it pretty close.
Yeah, I think they must have just had some empty slots. So they were going into some Slack channels, being like, "Hey, I've got an interesting topic," and I was like, "Yeah, I'll pick one up." Okay.
Oh, where is that location?
Bilbao.
Ignorant the name. I don't know what country that's in.
Spain.
Okay. Okay, and that's it on the agenda, unless anybody's got anything else to throw in there as a late add to the conference topic. We'll move on to just freeform birds of a feather. Liam, I saw your hand raised.
Yeah, I just did want to chime in. I'm chair of WebAssembly Day and also a chair of WASMCon. So if there's interest, I know there is a lot of overlap between those conferences and even TelcoCon. WebAssembly is just bleeding into all of the related deployment areas. For WASMCon, CFP is closed. We got almost 100 submissions, which was incredible for a first-time conference. It'll be in Bellevue, September 6th and 7th. And then on the 8th, we're actually doing a Bytecode Alliance hackathon, where we'll work on componentizing the world. The big thing that's launching is component support. So think like pluggable Lego blocks, including language support for JavaScript, Go, Python, as well as Rust. And then all these statically compiled languages, of course, are supported as well. C, C++, all that stuff. So it should be a lot of fun. Tickets are available now. We may sell out, I don't know. We're planning on around 400 for the main WASMCon and then 200 for the hackathon on the following Friday, but all are welcome. Just like with Telco Day and the Edge Kubernetes on Edge Day, CFP is still open for WASM Day. So there's yet another form where you can submit talks to there as well.
Liam, out of interest, do you have a link for that? Because I've got a very cool topic. Well, I think it's a very cool topic for WASM.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll drop it into chat. All of the CFPs for all of the days are available through one form, I believe. But I'll put it in the chat here momentarily.
Yeah, the other thing, Liam, is I put the agenda notes doc in the chat. If you want to add it in the long-term running agenda notes doc for the conference, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll put it there. For WASMCon, we're working through all the ratings now, and there's still a little room for invited talks. There's a few folks that we're trying to get on the schedule, like the Chrome V8 team. We think would be great to have on there, and a few others. So if you have something that you feel is especially relevant, ping me and I can socialize it across the CFP reviewers.
That's great. Andy, I think you have your hand up too.
Yeah, I do have my hand up. Thanks, Steve. Welcome back. I just wanted, I think I asked the question last time and it kind of circulated a bit in the group. We were going to come back and figure it out. Do we have anything scheduled in terms of a slot for the IoT Edge to talk?
Well, for the IoT Edge Day, this group wouldn't normally submit anything there. That's, just any individual member or get together with a few of them. And that
Mhm.
is still open for submits. And you've got I think, at least a fair amount of time left. So that would be just anybody who wants to go for it. For that maintainer track, that's quite a bit more restricted. So the application process would have to be initiated by one of the leaders of this group, which is myself, Dan, or Kate. But any member can be a speaker on that. And that is a competitive CFP process now. It would normally be something centered on a specific activity of the group rather than some project that falls under the broad category of IoT Edge. So historically, we've given talks on just broad coverage. I would think the things that would be valid for that would be to cover the white paper draft we have underway. Also, that spreadsheet that I started on, a summary of all the open source edge related projects. We could perhaps give a talk on that or combine the two. And any prospective thing that this group wanted to take on as a group. It's really for kind of group centric activity, or we have done just broad coverage, things like all the open source projects related to Edge would be a broad subject in the space of open source and Edge. So something that would be totally general on open source and Edge would be also amenable to one of those maintainer track proposals. I think the attitude is, in terms of speakers, like I say, the actual form has to be filled out by leadership, but they don't have to be even one of the speakers, although I think generally it has been that one of the leaders would be on there, and anybody else who joins. I think generally, as a reviewer myself, you look for people who are speaking to have been actually active in the group. You don't want somebody who never joins a meeting and just came in out of nowhere. That's probably going to be deemed not quite appropriate because they're not, a regular member. But does that summarize it for you? So
Yeah, and I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn, but I know that there was a draw for Frank, Brandon, we're thinking, Joel, we're thinking about, putting forth the white paper draft that we've been working on, as you mentioned, as one of those.
Yeah, I think we can do that. So the other thing is, I believe they have caps on the numbers of speakers. And also, I didn't look at the current rules, but that in the past, there have been diversity requirements. So once you go over a certain, it's not an issue if you have one speaker, but as soon as you get a group of speakers, they're going to look at the mix of who is there. And a number of people have worked on that white paper draft, but I don't think it will be viable to have the whole group show up. It's, you'd be looking to compose something that would extend up to, say, 3 people. Frankly, I think those sessions are only 30 minutes, 30 minutes-ish. So
it's 2 people.
You have trouble. You could shoehorn in 3, but beyond that, I don't think you could pull it off. The transitions at the microphone would just be burning up all your time.
Yeah, you can't do 3 people switching in and out on a microphone either. That's hard.
Yeah, well, we've done 3 and it worked, but you have to be quick and rehearse it, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I can speak for Frank. I wouldn't rehearse it at all. We would just do it cold.
Okay.
Yeah, and related question, does it have to be a presentation or can it be a panel discussion on the very same topic? Because that typically allows
you could, and then maybe you could have 4. There's
idea.
Additional rules on panel discussions, by the way, or at least there have been historically. So a panel discussion might work. The other things that favor acceptance, they look at diversity as a criteria for acceptance in my experience, but There's also a real desire to get user talks. Those are typically viewed as underrepresented at the KubeCon events, so that if you were to do a panel, I think that, and expect to get it accepted, I think what you'd want to do is put actual users on that panel as opposed to vendors. So if you wanted to do that, I think the deadline for those maintainer track sessions is coming up pretty soon, as is, it might even be this coming Sunday. So maybe we can take that offline on a Slack discussion if you want to push forward on that. And I'm amenable to filling out the paperwork, or Dion could do it, or K2, I don't think is here today, could do it. It's a private link, so that other than the leadership of this group, nope, you don't get the link to submit that CFP for maintainer track. Okay. Anything else on conferences before we move on to freeform discussion? Okay, I'll take that silence as a no. So just anybody who wants to bring anything up, just jump on your mic and blurt it out, I guess.
I can say one quick update, still in progress, but last time, Steve, when you weren't here, we had another iteration over the white paper that we're working on. And one thing that was brought up was to go and add, because I believe that was discussed before I joined this group, but there was already discussion earlier on, like there is a set of different constraints at the edge. Some are network related, some are data related, some are resource related, and some are security or policy related, and would be good to go and list those. And well, there is now a small section in the document that does exactly that. So that talks a little bit about these constraints and gives examples for what these are, to go and complement the white paper on the behaviors a little further. And what I've also done is there were a couple of draft pieces or kind of more commentary that was put into the document. I separated that out into a section at the very end of the document, so that we have a clean part at the very beginning, and then a section that is currently called draft, where text that is not fully complete, where people just provided a skeleton or the likes, or where topics were just under discussion, that this part that needs clarification is clearly separated from the main body of the text. So those were the two quick updates. And from the chat with Brandon earlier on, he proposed that we kind of chew on this a little further, and then maybe do a proper review in the next call. And I'm not sure, what do you think from a maturity perspective? Unfortunately, we don't really have everybody here. Like Joel couldn't make it, Brandon had a drop, but do you think that's feasible?
A lot depends on people showing up to do that final review. And just as an aside, since Andy brought up the possibility that we would talk about this in a maintainer track session, I think that the way to do that, if it goes for maintainer track, is that would be a good place to announce the publication of it in final form, in my opinion, right. Which means it has to be in final form. And technically, for these talks, you are supposed to have your slide deck and things submitted several weeks before the event. My observation has been that if you ignore all of those demands from the Linux Foundation emails, they don't kick you out of the conference. And I've seen plenty of examples where people get away with it, but you're supposed to actually have it done in advance of the conference, not day of. So I think that, Frank, that you're right, that this should be pushed forward. And at some time, especially in the summer with a lot of people taking holiday, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, you're never going to get everybody together. And to get things done, maybe the way to do it is to just, say that no comment at this point will be deemed approval if you want to go that far. And as long
Well,
as
we
you
don't
give
need to
them
have to
plenty
go
of,
that way. We could first do another kind of, we could round it up a little and then do another pass through with a group, maybe in 2 weeks' time. Unfortunately, I will be on PTO, but hopefully there will be somebody else around. And then, well, we can go and then call it final maybe, and the week meeting after next, which is then early August, which should still give us a little bit of time, because I think the machinery in the Linux Foundation takes a while to go and get it published, beautified, and PDF and all that good stuff. And then, as you say, like we're probably in a rush already to go and create the associated slides and presentation, at least the draft format, in order to make or raise the comfort level at Linux Foundation that there will be a presentation and there will be slides, which is why they push for an early submission always, right?
Yeah. So I'd say if you think it needs a round or two of discussion, it's actually probably mandatory to get it on the agenda for the next meeting, or have a supplemental meeting, which is what we did in the last white paper. I think that maybe the entire group isn't all that interested in it, or, doesn't deem themselves qualified to be appropriate for the final review. It's up to them, really. But let's try to get a review pass done either in the meeting or sidebar in a supplemental meeting. Then take it to something where you would allow offline voting. Just put a link to a survey or something and send up, make sure that everybody whose name is in there as a reviewer gets invited to just give a thumbs up approval or a thumbs down. It's not quite ready yet. And that way you can record it. And when you get to the PR process where we're going to check it in under the masthead of the CNCF structure of working groups, I think it's best to be able to say in that PR that you had this survey of the reviewers and here's the results of the poll, that, not just one person who puts in the PR just does it on their own name, that you indicate that there's actually a widespread consensus for this thing to be published. And I think that's the way that this should go down. So summary.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Right. Unfortunately, we don't have it in Git. It's a bloody Google Doc, right?
It doesn't, but I'm saying to get
easier,
there's a
right? PR.
And the trouble with Git for being in the draft stage is the commenting process is kind of a mess. And I don't know. We discussed whether it should be a Google Doc or Git from the beginning. And I think this group has tried both ways, and the consensus was leave it as Google Doc while in the commenting and review stage.
Okay. That'll work.
So anyway, we'll put it on the agenda for the next meeting. And I haven't looked at it in several weeks, so I'll take a look, and
cool.
Feel free to give a reminder to group members on the Slack channel to go take a look at it. And kind of worded in a polite way of saying, this is your final opportunity kind of thing. Andy, if you want to get
Brendan, Brendan is way better at that.
Okay. And then Andy, if you want to get this into a maintainer track, we should talk about that, because I think we got to get that submitted. And maybe we could do a maintainer track where, we share this with coverage of that list of open source projects or something, so that this doesn't have to fill the whole thing. If we went the direction of a panel, I think that you have to identify the panel participants in that submit. And at this stage, having gathered panel participants in the past, man, I think that's a big ask to assemble a panel in less than a week and get the people. You have to have their names, their emails, their permission that they're actually going to be there. And I think that would be a challenge, but if somebody else other than me wants to take on assembling that, I'm not against it.
Let's take it, let's think more about it, but I think I'll contact you, get you you and I get it on the same page at least, and then I can share that back with Frank and Joel and Brandon. Then we can come up with what we feel is the right way forward and be prepared for either direction. But yeah, I think you're right. It would be kind of a logistical nightmare at this stage of the game in the middle of the summer to grab and get all those folks, pulled in.
Here's another thing for speakers that just occurred to me too. They now have quotas on how many sessions you can be a speaker in.
Yeah, it's only two. Yeah.
Okay, so that might apply to somebody who was thinking that maybe they would be a presenter in that they might already be limited out.
Yeah, that's what I was asking. Because I mean, obviously, I've got two of my own, and then Frank and I were collaborating on one as well, or two. And so yeah, I think we might already be tapped out. I didn't know if that was still added to the quota.
Yeah, it might be that it's in a separate category, but I don't know. But you most definitely should look before you make an assumption that you'd be the one doing it, because there is definitely a quota, and there's a hard limit that is published. And then I think, practically speaking, the program committee tries to favor a broader array of speakers coming in the conference, so that even below the limit, it probably reduces your acceptance of getting an accept if you're already speaking in some other session.
Yeah, I've already been reached out to by the CNCF to clarify, which two I would be part of.
Mm-hmm.
But
So going for a third probably is pushing.
Yep. Yeah.
But we have the benefit that we have multiple authors. So yeah, well, let's focus on first getting the topic in, and then we can go and see who would be, because also need people that can go and ultimately travel to Chicago, right? That again might be a hurdle. We've seen that quite a bit on LFN site, where a lot of people weren't able to travel. Like the recent design forum, 90% people attended remotely still.
And I don't think remote is an option for this.
Correct.
Way, so.
At least not for the presentation side. So you want the people be on site, right? Yeah.
So Frank, can you think about who you want to present this, and I'll track down the logistics of how to get it registered. Divide and conquer this way.
Yeah, and maybe
let's take that offline over Slack, and we can go. And
also offline, if somebody wants to write like a one paragraph, I think it's usually 600 to 1,000 character limit on the description. Take a crack, even if it's full of typos, at what that would look like. Liam, you have your answer raised.
Yeah, Andy, were all your submissions to KubeCon General, or did they include some of the days? My experience in the past has been that not a way around the limit, but that the days are all counted separately. So we had a speaker previously from our team that spoke in 2 different KubeCon sessions, as well as 3 different days on the same day. Well, it was last year, and it was when the days were spread across 2 days. But he spoke at Edge, Hotel, and Wasm Day all at once, Brooks Townsend. So I think there are some ways you can be very strategic in your applications, just as a tip to share that to help get your message out and across a bit easier. However, I'm unclear for WasmCon. We just switched over to Sessionize, which as a CFP reviewer is amazing. It was just a real easy tool to use. It gives you consolidated metrics and reporting all baked in. If you've done a bunch of CFP work. I was told that that KubeCon will be switching to Sessionize as well, although I don't know that that happened or not. And then maybe there's so they may count the days differently with the new platform that they're on, because I think before it was a little hard. Each one of the days, the CFPs were essentially done via Google Docs, which I'm sure you're familiar with.
Yeah, I think I did the CFP was through Sessionize. So
it's the backend is awesome as a platform.
Okay.
Sounds good.
So we'll poke around on that. Okay, thank you for that.
The other personal comment regarding multiple sessions is, having done a lot of them in the past, it's almost always unplanned, but I've believe it or not done 5 talks at KubeCon 3 times. And generally it happened because a speaker canceled and asked me to take over for them.
Yeah.
But it's a killer. And my contention is you never want to go there. You don't have trouble with that many. You don't have time to enjoy the conference and get anything out of it yourself. It's like real work that is exhausting. So I don't know why anybody would ever even want to go. 3 is kind of an upper limit for planning purposes. And even that I think is kind of rough. But
Okay,
maybe if,
price too. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, let's declare conferences in the paper dead and move on to any other things. We've still got 25 minutes or so left. Does anybody have anything they want to put out on the table that you want to discuss or you came across that was interesting lately?
Yeah, actually, I'm interested in really the definition of edge. I'm not expert in this field, so just interested in this area. I found some definition and posting it in the channel, in the Slack channel. Just anyone aware of what's going on in the the overall the whole ecosystem? Not only CNCF, what about what's being worked on when it comes to edge? I'm aware of, for example, the LF Edge have some discussions, but actually it looks like LF Edge is not that active. Actually, maybe just in the Slack channel is not that active. So I don't know, is there any other places, for example, I don't know, is it even a topic in things like IETF or whatever standard organization about what is edge and how the classifications and things like that?
Okay, I'll cover some of those and I'll invite others to speak too. But in terms of activity of LS Edge in Slack, if you're looking at the CNCF Slack, yeah, it's quiet there because they have their own Slack. So they have an independent Slack that's different from the Slack where CNCF and Kubernetes lives. And that said, I think it's relatively quiet except for individual projects. So I think that Slack is actually called LF Edge, LF space Edge. And then they have a channel for individual projects. In general, the activity within those individual projects, it varies quite a bit, where some of them are ghost towns and some of them have multiple posts per day. The projects, I don't know, I just opened the Slack myself to look because I'm in there, but the channels I joined were Acrano, Badel, Eve, the FIDO, which is a secure device onboard, Fledge, General, Home Edge, Open Horizon, etc. So you could go there for specific LF Edge, and LF Edge does publish a definition of edge. So does Eclipse Foundation. So do the white papers that this group has put out. There's a lot of intersection, but the bottom line, I'm getting kind of cynical on these edge definitions because to me, I've come to the conclusion that definitions are not, they really aren't something that's right or wrong. They're something that's useful or not useful. And useful depends on the context you're in. So if you're in a specific industry like telco or something like that, use a definition of edge that's useful to you. If you're in industrial IoT, use a definition that's useful to you. They might vary. So just to give you a sampling of what some of them are based on resource. So edge is co-aligned with having low resource, meaning low compute, low power, low or no internet connectivity. Some others are dependent on a definition that they're far away from cloud, but close to users and devices. The definitions vary quite a bit. And I think I have come to the conclusion it's fruitless to try to come up with one universal thing delivered on stone tablets that doesn't change. And, you order the world to abide by this definition. That exercise is a waste of time and useless, and it will be ignored. So just pick one. If you want one to cite because you're writing about it or talking about it, you can probably find a source validating any attitude you want to take, whether it's based on network connectivity, resource, location, whatever, and just go with it and cite your source. It's all contextual. Anybody else want to vent or add their opinion on that, or you're free to contradict what I just said?
I tend to agree, for as much as we try to put our hands around it ourselves, right? So I think you're right. It's very contextual and depends on people's definition of what an edge is. It varies greatly, as we've spoken to lots of people who think that edges are something that are low, lightweight, very little in terms of compute power, maybe also have an extra modality attached to them, like a camera or some other type of sensor, visual, audio, etc. And then there's other people that could take the exact opposite and make it, a full-blown server that's sitting up on a telephone pole somewhere that's fairly beefy and maybe as much as like a mech might be considered for someone like a telco.
Yeah.
So,
There's plenty of retail stores that have a whole rack of equipment that
yeah,
by the measures of things you do, they really are edge. I'm
Mhm.
not going to argue with that, but yeah, it could vary from a rack of equipment to something not big enough to even run Linux. And
Yeah.
I think settling in my mind now is this theory that they're all edge, and the real trick of edge is being able to come up with sort of a bundling solution that, to me, a context of edge is that if you're going to try to manage these over time, you're going to have a lot of them. And the real crux of this is coming up with the management infrastructure that lets you deploy them and manage them at that kind of scale, which is quite a bit different than what you might have in a public cloud. You have scale there too, but it's a different type of scale, and dealing with the issues of low, no, or intermittent connectivity.
So the way I see, I read I guess listened to a lot of talk by the big guys like CEOs. So the three area that's really popular topic, and I think most people agree, is number one, AI ML, number two, security, and in a way, number three is edge. AI ML and security, there's a lot of different organizations working on them. There are a lot of overlapping areas. However, there is a tendency to gradually, have it well defined, what's the domain and how the different foundation work together to, clarify the landscape and come up with solutions. Edge is the only area I do not see any collaborations to define it even. Maybe that's my impression.
I
Yeah,
think it's
I don't
more
know. There's
prop-
plenty of
Oh,
definitions. Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
No, I was just going to say is that for me, it depends on the properties, right? And I think that people are somewhat agreeable on properties, but not necessarily attributing it to any one specific edge definition, right? Now, you brought up like disconnected operations. I know you were talking about security and AI in another space, but there's also, it's all the considerations that I think that we drew down on the white paper that we've been working on, right? What makes an edge native application and what are the properties of edge devices that you have to consider when building an edge native application. So I think that's what we were kind of trying to get our hands around on that in that white paper. So if I couldn't give you a 60 character or less definition, but I think that white paper intends to encapsulate that. That's just my foray into the discussion. Sorry, Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And part of that is there are all these characteristics, and I think Liam drops some of these in the chat of disrupted. In a practical, at a single edge location, it could be that of that list of low connectivity, low resource, what desire for latency, desire for data sovereignty, maybe only half that list applies to you in your use case, but you can still get great value out of these management systems and the articles that are put in place on how to go about approaching that in an efficient way. And Victor, the other things I think you brought up, AI, ML, I think that's a brand new activity for Edge. So this is one thing that I think is dramatically undercovered because people are just getting there, sort of like, even though AI, ML has been out there for, I think, 2 decades, a lot of the resources required to allow this to take off technology-wise have just they have gone around a curve, and it's a combination of technology enablement along with the world just being aware of it. It's sort of like the whole ChatGPT thing woke the world's eyes up, or maybe the world, I mean, is corporate management. And yeah, it opened their eyes up as to what the potential is, to where they're unleashing budgets to be spent on carrying these kinds of ideas out in AI ML, because they got convinced that this could be something that would either up their business by a large multiple or put them out of business. And suddenly everybody just in the past year is looking at this, and there's not a whole lot of background. Frankly, it's changing so rapidly that if somebody wrote a white paper attempting to cover the AI ML for Edge a year ago, it would be way past its sell-by date and would smell pretty bad at this point, because it's moving so rapidly. It's probably one of these things where my opinion is, in AI ML for Edge, it's a time to get in there and play with it and do proofs of concepts rather than start writing things down that will be obsolete in a year anyway. And it's a real interesting area, but I think if you use Google search, you'll find a bunch of stale articles, if any. Maybe asking ChatGPT gets you something better, but I'd be skeptical. And it's kind of like, just go get your hands on some equipment and start playing with it, because you probably know about as much as anybody else at this point. Yeah.
Maybe just like Andy said, right? The paper you're working on is probably going to be the how to say, the first splash into the whole ecosystem, like, really getting attention into this area. Because talking about all the stuff that's being worked on, CNCF and everywhere, OpenSSF, security, AI, ML, when you move all that into the Edge/IoT and mobile world, things get 10 times, if not 100% more complicated, right? So it's just an interesting area. Maybe that's why it's just people have not even begin to look into how to resolve problem in this area.
Well, Steve, I think I would agree with you from a technology perspective that it's moving so fastly that anything would be past its sell-by date. But I think if you take a step back from the the procedures to the underlying reasons, I think that those are pretty timeless, and those have been a consistent trend that have been pushing us towards the edges or towards distributed. And it's not just because the data is on the edge; it's latency and determinism. It's privacy and security. Look at Facebook getting whacked for pulling all of the French data back to the US. Limited or delimited autonomy, regulatory reasons. I think those are some of the compelling motivators that we have that are driving intelligence out towards the edges. The last 10 years, the last decade was dominated by this great lift and shift into the clouds, and I really believe that the next 10 years are about bringing the compute to the data. Would be the high level shingle that I would hang that under. So that's just my 2 cents on that. And then underneath that, I do agree that the world is moving so fast and so quickly that if you even just consider the value of edge deployed ML, Llama's changed the game. When you can have an ML model on your desktop that is nearly as powerful as something that you could previously host in the cloud, it does really change the game. Before, I dropped a link to a video we did at ARM Summit last year, where we talked about running lightweight machine learning models on the edge that could then, using Wasm Cloud, that could then, leverage cloud-based models depending on privacy, security, performance, availability, or other reasons. And we sort of walk through the technical, how did we get this to work, and all the underlying reasons. But when we take a step back, I think that the technology is moving so fast that now you might, strategically move compute back to the edges to save money or for cost or all kinds of other reasons. So I think it's super interesting. And Steve, we actually work with that Sony team. They are a big WebAssembly shop, and if you've seen their platform that they're building, it's a really neat kind of stuff on their approach for the world.
Yeah, the reason I brought that up for those who don't have the chat window written, I talked in this group a few weeks ago, shortly after KubeCon Europe. I went and saw their booth, and it was kind of interesting. What they were doing was an attempt to use WebAssembly to write what they called a virtualization wrapper around ML accelerators for edge devices. And I think Sony's angle in this is that they make camera chips so that this would be used in their context for machine learning related to image processing, but it could be open-ended. The concept is just virtualize an accelerator, because these edge accelerators are all going to be just a little bit different, and it makes it tough to write a higher level app if you have to deal with all of these differences. They said there that they intended to open source this in the June timeframe. And the way I came across this article is I just went and looked to try to figure out if that had happened. It doesn't appear that it has, because I didn't see anything about it in their GitHub repo, but I assume that it's still in the pipeline because they posted this article June 13 that seems related, giving it a name of EVP, Edge Virtualization Platform. And I think like I say, it's probably in the pipeline, and there's interesting things happening in this space.
So the virtualization of capability providers is something that Wasm Cloud has done since it's been in the CNCF so a few years, where you define a contract like SQL, and you use contract-driven development to define an interface for what that looks like, and then you can have pluggable providers. Dapper is very similar, they do that as well. From a WebAssembly perspective, this is actually a part of a bigger standard that's referred to as the component model, and it uses a language called WIT, WebAssembly interface types, to let you define those interfaces. So I was working on the blog post for the WebAssembly roadmap, and we're announcing, it should hopefully go out this week, but those are the formal specifications that I believe even Sony's relying on underneath the hood in order to define those. And groups of collections of these interfaces are defined into what you call worlds. So for example, the two worlds that we are shipping are WASI CLI, which includes things like wall clock and file system types and network and TCP, things like that. And then HTTP as well, which has obvious huge implications for FAS and functions as a service and things like that. There is another set of standards that's called WASI Cloud, WASI WebAssembly System Interfaces, that defines common cloud interfaces like Blob Store. Plugins could be file system, S3, anything that you can implement a Blob Store on. But those have been deferred and are moving just in a parallel track outside of the standard. One of the reasons why we pulled those out of the standard was because we didn't want all of the WebAssembly engines to have to support 100, new interfaces on day one. We wanted to keep some optional outside of the standard. And to accelerate that work, there's a new definition, a virtualization layer that lets you virtualize those interfaces for testing, CI/CD, or essentially have placeholders in there. So watch the blog post. It'll be on the Bytecode Alliance. I'll try to drop it into Slack when I think about it, or if I remember to, and link it in the notes here. But it'll have links to, the blog post does already have links to, where we are in garbage collection, where we are on threads, and all of the other related underlying standards.
Wow, this sounds fascinating. I don't know if there are any existing sources that would take this kind of specifically into an edge context. But if you have any links to prior presentations or blog posts or YouTubes, I'd really like to see them. And if they don't exist, I'd invite you to maybe yourself or somebody to come to this group and give a presentation on that, or submit it to the conferences, or both.
Yeah, we do both. I mean, if you look at any of the previous Wasm Cloud talks, at the time we created it, WIT didn't exist, the WebAssembly interface types, the IDL that you use to define the interfaces. So we used a tool from Amazon called Smithy, and we're in the process now of converting all of those to WIT, so that you have fully standards compliance within Wasm Cloud. Now, Wasm Cloud is an application runtime that sits on top of a WebAssembly runtime called WASM-Time. And the WebAssembly, WASM-Time is the engine that runs, but what WASM Cloud gives you is tooling for starting, scaling, running, operating. It runs on top of Kubernetes, but it also runs independently of itself. I'm more than happy to. I think there's probably two opportunities here. The first would be to walk through the roadmap together and go through the key standards so that like the terminology and the language can become clear. And then the second one could be to demonstrate some of these things with WASM Cloud, which is open source and in the CNCF. We are actually in the process of applying for incubating right now.
That sounds great. And I think maybe even a general context of WebAssembly, because I think there's great potential at Edge for this to be of value, given that one of the characteristics of Edge is that device hardware life cycles tend to be really long historically. In a public cloud or a big commercial data center, that equipment gets replaced every 3 to 5 years. You rarely see something 7 years old. It's kind of warranty runs out, they change it. But when you get to these edge locations, plenty of stuff lives out there for decades.
Absolutely.
And because of that, it's not homogeneous, and WebAssembly gives you a great opportunity to land applications that are quite agnostic in terms of what they're running on, yet still be manageable from the context of dealing with thousands of nodes.
That's right. But there's even a greater benefit here when we think about, the layers of abstraction that we've climbed through. The next big layer that's available to abstract is the application libraries. Those are the things, we pull in all this open source code and we statically compile it at compile time, and then embed it and bake all those vulnerabilities in the app in a container and ship it. What WebAssembly is doing is it's trying to drive that next level of abstraction where capabilities are actually loaded at runtime. And the big advantage there then is you ship business logic in any language. You say this needs a web server, it needs a SQL database, it needs a file system, it needs a blob store, and it's going to open these ports. And then at runtime, the platform gives you the latest version of those components, or the version of those components that work in that particular domain. So is this all science fiction? No, this is exactly how Fastly and Cloudflare work. If you've ever programmed on workers or compute, underneath the hood, that's just WebAssembly. Cloudflare runs V8, which is the engine out of Chrome, and Fastly runs WASM-Time. So this is, I think, very real tech that's being used to deliver trillions of transactions in a given quarter. Fastly posted a blog on their first trillion transactions last year, the year before. And I really think that across cloud native, this is the next epic of tech that we're going to slide into.
Yeah, and in terms of Edge, okay. And in terms of Edge native, I think it's really underappreciated. At this stage, I would contend that WebAssembly is still something a bunch of devs have heard of. But when you come to the pointy hair boss out of Dilbert and that kind of crowd, no, they barely know what it is. And kind of the shiny object of ML maybe is distracting them now. But there's an opportunity for those things to be related.
There is.
And I think that a lot of this talk about WebAssembly being the translation force to hide differences in the underlying hardware maybe has to overcome people's attitudes of having heard that story before with Java and getting burnt out on the experience. Maybe not because the concept was bad, but maybe a lot of that is because the garbage collection of memory in Java kind of burned it for a lot of edge things that needed determinism. I don't know that WebAssembly is guaranteed to be different in that context, but I think you can implement it in a way that you're not exposed to that. So,
I think you make a number of compelling points, but to be honest, I think that, like last year, one of the things that we analyzed was that the WebAssembly standards were moving too slowly. So I don't know if anybody on this call knows Bailey Hayes, but we recruited her in. She was writing the WebAssembly plugins for single store, bring your compute to the data, ship your logic into your database. And Cosmonic hired her and has really searched her into the standards to help organize and collaborate and coordinate Earlier this year, we did a private road mapping summit, and what it's resulted in is an incredible amount of focus on a smaller number of standards. And what it's meant is that you're seeing now WebAssembly language tooling coming across the line for Python, for Go 121, which is the next release, for a Kotlin, .NET, a JavaScript. There's 2 different ways to bring it across. And the standards have really accelerated pretty dramatically. And Bailey's not solely responsible for it at all, but she spends a lot of her time in the ecosystem. And like, creating, I don't want to share the roadmap because we're about to launch the blog, but I have this like gorgeous roadmap in front of me. She's the one investing a lot of that time coordinating across teams at companies all around the ecosystem. So I'll see if I can bring her along to this meeting, and we can do the blog. I'm still trying to get out this week, and maybe we can do a walkthrough of the standards and then some demonstrations as well. And this is exactly how I know the Sony Midokura team is. They are super geeked up about this tech as well, as I think is most of the people that are in WebAssembly, because it's still that better together moment in WebAssembly where we see all this great opportunity and collaborating to get agree on the standards. Because what's really neat is, and I think we were all prepared for this last year, if components are the new container, it's going to be an amazing world when you can ship units of logic across any of those platforms. Cosmonic, which is my company, Fastly, Cloudflare, Wasm Cloud, or any of the other runtimes that are out there. Kate Goldenring works for a great company called Fermion. They've got an awesome FAS runtime called Spin. All of us now will be able to ship those components. I don't think the world's really ready for something that small and that portable and as to what it means.
Sounds great. Yeah, just put yourself on the agenda for any future meeting you want. And this sounds really interesting.
Yeah.
Dan, I think you were dabbling in WebAssembly with Rust, weren't you? Are you still up to that?
Yeah, that was a while ago, so nothing recently, unfortunately. But hopefully, I'll come back to that at some point.
Assembly is a very interesting area. I've been helping customer doing database migration to the cloud for the past 10 years. So most of the time, customer just left with just Edge. I mean, that's the only place that customer has, and that's where they're innovating. And the RF Edge, really, there's nothing going on discussion over there. So I was hoping this could be really the place where all the edge related topic is, including the landscape discussion, can start from here.
Okay, great. We're about out of time here. Last call if somebody's got something quick that takes a minute or two. Otherwise, we'll call this to a close and see you again in a couple of weeks. Okay, bye everybody. Thanks for coming. It's been a great and interesting discussion.